What is the carbon cycle? The carbon cycle is the circulation of carbon through the biosphere. The source of inorganic carbon is CO2, which is present in the air and in water. Green plants and algae extract CO2 from the atmosphere and fixate it into carbohydrates. To fixate means to turn inorganic carbon into organic carbon. The fixation occurs through what is probably one of the most important inventions, evolutionary inventions, for life on Earth, which has been the photosynthesis. The photosynthesis is the process by means of which there is this conversion from inorganic to organic carbon, thanks to the transformation of energy from the sun. The photons coming from the sun help overcome the energy barrier necessary for these reactions to take place. So the energy for photosynthesis comes from the sun's photons. Photosynthesis has literally changed the face of the Earth. And here there is a little schematic picture that shows what the prebiotic, so pre-photosynthesis, and modern atmosphere looks like. And I draw your attention both to the upper part and to the lower part, all very schematic, obviously. So, important thing to notice in the prebiotic atmosphere, before the photosynthesis was invented, we have large concentration of CO2, large concentration of diatomic nitrogen, and afterwards we still find diatomic nitrogen, but the big change is that instead of CO2 we have oxygen. And if we look down in the lower parts of the biosphere, everything looks completely different. We have plants. We have plants that grow thanks to the energy mechanism provided by photosynthesis. And this energy mechanism is hugely important not just for the plants, but also for the animals that eat the plants, and they have therefore a very rich source of energy. And these plants push a lot of oxygen into the atmosphere, and this oxygen in turn is a powerful energy mechanism for the animals that are developing, that are evolving. And therefore, when we see programs like Walking on Dinosaurs and the like, and we see the evolution from lumbering reptiles that move around very slowly to the T-Rex and the Velociraptor that run as fast as gazelles, well, it is thanks to the O2 in the atmosphere, which has been pumped in the atmosphere via photosynthesis by the plants, that all these transformations are possible. I'm being carried away. Let's go back to the flow. So some of the carbohydrates produced by the photosynthesis are used immediately as energy. They are metabolized. Some are retained as living material, for instance, wood in trees. Some are converted into fats and polysaccharides that then are used as energy mechanisms as well. And then the CO2 is returned to the atmosphere through animals breathing, which is called animal respiration, plant respiration, and the decomposition of dead matter, whereby by oxidations CO2 and methane is released back into the atmosphere. The organic carbon from dead plants can undergo several different fates. One possibility, it can undergo chemical reaction with what are called metamorphic rocks, turning back into CO2. And then this CO2 can either be retained or released via volcanoes and outgassing. In all of these processes, there is little net change of CO2 in the atmosphere. It is mainly a continuous flow, as it is schematically shown in this figure here. So we have different flows. We have animal respiration, bringing CO2 back into the atmosphere, plant respiration. We have combustion from volcanoes. We have combustion of fossil fuels. This is all bringing CO2 back into the atmosphere, then is taken away from assimilation by plants and animals and assimilation by phytoplankton, assimilation into the soil. It is a continuous cycle with At steady state, there is almost no net imbalance in one direction or another. And this other picture gives the same message in greater detail. Now, there are several natural sinks of CO2. One, which is historically very important for what is happening at the moment, some dead organic matter, under suitable condition of temperature and pressure, turns into oil, natural gas, and coal. And this is what we are burning at the moment. So at the moment, we are burning the CO2 which had been captured millions of years ago. So we are spewing out of the atmosphere all of a sudden, in an extremely short period of time, CO2 which had been sequestrated millions of years ago. So another source of net difference in atmospheric CO2 concentration is from the change in the amount of CO2 in CO2 storing material. Storing materials are, for instance, growing forests, and I stress growing forests. It is only the addition of organic material to a forest that takes away net CO2. And oceans are another extremely powerful sink of CO2. So what if there is at any point an imbalance between emitted and absorbed CO2? Well, the oceans are huge and powerful sinks of excess CO2. However, their rate of absorption is slow. And furthermore, the more they absorb, the less effective they become at absorbing more CO2. This picture gives a schematic view of the role played by oceans. We have solar energy and we have atmospheric CO2 that becomes dissolved CO2 in the ocean water. And then this CO2 finds its way, either phytoplankton uses via photosynthesis produces organic matter, plankton using carbonate to produce their shells. All of these things die and decompose, they fall to the bottom of the ocean and they form sediment at the bottom of the ocean that stores away huge amounts of CO2. Also, healthy coastal ecosystems play a very important role in absorbing CO2. Mangroves, for instance, are 10 times more efficient than fir trees in capturing CO2. So there is a big difference. And here in this picture here, there is the combination of all the different flows, the ocean, the fossil fuel use, the plant respiration, the next terrestrial uptake, and the convention in this figure here is that figures in red mean emissions into the atmosphere, and figures in white mean subtraction from the atmosphere. Before we go any further, it is very, very important to debunk a myth, a skeptical myth that has been going around. And this version is by Dominic Lawson, who wrote at the time in The Independent, and I am summarizing what is written here. He says, the burning of fossil fuels sends about 7 gigatons of CO2 per year into the atmosphere, which sounds like a lot. Yet the biosphere and the ocean send about 1,936,000 gigatons of CO2 per year in the atmosphere. Reducing man-made carbon emission is megalomania, exaggerating man's significance. So what Mr. Lawson is doing is comparing a number of 7 against a number like 36,000 or 1,900 and says, look, 7 is so tiny, really our contribution is nothing. I don't know if Mr. Lawson is uninformed, or I don't know if Mr. Lawson, for other reason, doesn't want to inform himself, but this argument is really, really, really wrong. It's wrong on so many accounts. First of all, we do not send 7 gigatons of CO2. We have seen this before. That is 7 gigatons of carbon. There is a factor, it is about 26 for CO2. Let's forget about this little detail. The point is that natural flows have been almost in exact balance for millennia. So it is true that natural flows of CO2 into the atmosphere are larger than the man-made flows, but almost identical flows are taken away. So how much has been emitted is almost exactly balanced by how much is absorbed. So it is not relevant at all that these natural flows are larger than human emissions. The natural flows almost exactly cancel out, and therefore the relatively small 20-something gigatons of CO2 emitted in the atmosphere do make a difference. Okay, we have dispelled the myth about the insignificance of human emissions, and let's go back to the flow. Now, here there is a very, very important concept to understand. When biomass is used to produce energy, it is considered to be carbon neutral. And you might ask, well, if I burn wood, clearly I am putting CO2 back in the atmosphere. Why doesn't it count as adding CO2 emission to the atmosphere? The point is that when I use biomass in order to produce energy, I am releasing back into the atmosphere CO2 that has been extracted, that has been put into the biomass 5, 10 or 20 years ago. So over a scale of 20 years, the net effect is zero. It is very different when I'm burning fossil fuel, because when I'm burning fossil fuel, I'm releasing back into the atmosphere CO2, which had been sequestrated millions of years ago. Therefore, apart from frictions, and I'll explain in a second what frictions are, we consider the use of biomass to produce energy carbon neutral. What are these frictions? Well, in every process there are literally frictions, imperfections. I have to transport the energy from the biomass from one place to the other. They will require some trucks. They will burn some form of energy. So it is not exactly carbon neutral, but to first approximation, we can say that use of biomass is carbon neutral. Furthermore, and this becomes interesting, if I use biomass CO2 and I combine with sequestration of the emitted CO2, I can get something a lot more interesting. What is sequestration? It is a process by means of which the CO2 is not released back into the atmosphere, but it is captured. If I capture and I store it safely, then I can actually reduce the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. It is very important. So if I use biomass in order to produce energy, I'm extracting CO2 from the atmosphere, and it has been extracted in the last 10, 15, 20 years, the time it took for the biomass to grow. It is burnt, but it is not put back into the atmosphere, it is sequestrated. So this is important. So what is the relevance of all of this for global warming? Well, if we believe, as we now do, that the concentration of CO2 or CO2 equivalent gases plays an important role in the change of temperature, and that the change in temperature is the most dangerous aspect of climate change, directly or indirectly, then the control of CO2 emissions, but CO2 concentration is really what matters, is one key aspect of controlling climate change. And therefore this control can be achieved either by reducing emissions or by capturing CO2 at production, which is called sequestration, or taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is called via negative emission technologies. Just to be clear, if I do sequestration of carbon released by burning fossil fuel, at best I am neutral, because I'm just avoiding to put in the atmosphere CO2 which had been sequestrated millions of years ago. If, on the other hand, I do sequestration of CO2 emitted by fresh, in quotes, biomass, this is negative. It is a subtraction of CO2 concentration from the atmosphere. And negative emission technologies is either the growth of forests, and we will see that this has pros and cons, but it could be also man-made devices that can engage in negative emission technologies. We will see all of this. Apart from controlling CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, are there any other levers that human can pull? Well, the only other lever that we can pull is the control of the reflectivity of the Earth, which is called the albedo. We will look into this as well. But this is not an easy option. We can, for instance, if I grow a lot of forests at northern latitude, it is true that I capture more CO2, they have to be new forests, but if these forests replace land, or rather cover land, which was snow-clad, there is less reflectivity. So I have to be very careful in the balance if I am better off or worse off. Alternatively, and it is the area of geoengineering, I could engage in rather sci-fi plans of micro-mirrors in space. Neither option is easy to implement or to control, especially the latter, and therefore the most realistic option is the control of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Now we are getting to a really important part in the discussion. We have done all the correlations, we have understood the carbon cycle, we have understood how the dynamic flows of CO2 in the atmosphere determine the concentration of residual concentration of CO2. Now we have finally to understand why this change in concentration of CO2 causes an increase in temperature. And we have to understand why a very small amount of CO2, we are talking about parts per million, can make such a big difference.